What's up, diggity dogs? I just made a mess in the other room. High five.
You're watching Fugitive Red Eye, and welcome to another Top 10 video. A few years ago, I did a video doing my top 10 favorite movies of all time, and I decided it was time to do a new version of that, because I've seen more movies, reevaluated some things, and my opinions have changed over time, as they tend to do. I held a vote on my channel community page asking if everyone thought I should include stuff that was already in the previous version, or if I should not. And it was unanimously decided to include the stuff that was in the previous version, simply because that would make it a more accurate top 10, because if I remove them just because they were on the other one, then that wouldn't make sense, because they're still in my top 10, so fair enough. That said, quite a few of them did make it over onto this list anyway, so it's a good thing we decided to keep them, because that way the list is more accurate. But you will notice some of them are in a different order than they were on the other video, and some of them are not on the video. And I'm actually going to go ahead and start out this video by mentioning the ones that didn't make it from the first list to the second list. First off, we have V for Vendetta. Barely missed this list. Just thinking about it later, I just didn't like it as much as some of the movies that are already on this list. Which I know is a bit strange, because some of the stuff on here was actually ranked below it before, but now it's still on the list. So again, my opinions change over time through reevaluation and rewatching and stuff like that. But V for Vendetta barely missed the list. It's basically my number 11. So there you go. Another one that is no longer on this list is the Saw series. Not to say that I don't still love the Saw series, but again, I've seen some other stuff, added some new stuff to the list, and again, it didn't make it. But Saw is my favorite splatter series. It is very good. I don't know if it would be my number 12 or where exactly it would place, but the Saw franchise is probably still in my top 20. Maybe not. It just depends on my mood, I think. Again, having to pick my favorites is a very difficult thing to do, just because there's so many great movies out there. But other than that, everything else that was in the previous version did make it onto this list. But there are a few new additions, which we will get to in due time. Now, to make it so that this list is not just nothing but Takeshi movies, because let's face it, those would take up a good chunk of this list. I've limited myself to one Takeshi movie. So as an honorable mention, I will say right off the gate, Takeshi's other movies are all, for the most part, honorable mentions. There's a couple of them that wouldn't be. You know, like, Getting Any is fun, but I wouldn't call it a favorite. And I don't really care for Glory to the Filmmaker, so that wouldn't even be close. But a lot of Takeshi's other movies are definitely honorable mentions and would have been on this list if I didn't make the only one Takeshi movie rule. And I think that that's a fair rule, just given the fact that Takeshi is my favorite director. Another honorable mention that barely missed this list and wasn't on either version to begin with is Pulp Fiction. I absolutely love Pulp Fiction, and the same thing with a lot of Tarantino's movies. So a lot of Tarantino movies could have been on this list too, but they just barely missed it. They're easily in my top 20 though, so just keep in mind that Tarantino is my second favorite director, and his movies are pretty highly regarded by me as well. But now that we've been through all that, without further ado, let's do the actual list. So number 10 is actually the same one that was number 10 last time, and that's The Matrix. Now again, I did rank The Matrix lower than V for Vendetta last time. The Matrix was number 10 and V for Vendetta was number 9. But the reason The Matrix still made it over is I feel like it had much more impact on me than V for Vendetta did. The Matrix is something I grew up with. It's a movie I've always loved. Again, I think the sequels are all right. The third one's the worst in my opinion. But it's still decent, especially the scenes when they're in the Matrix. But the first one I absolutely love. I feel like in many ways it's a masterpiece, because, you know, it's one of the earlier examples of the, you know, everything was just a simulation idea, and it does it really well. It has Keanu Reeves in it, and he's a great actor. I don't think he really broke out and got to be much more highly regarded until stuff like John Wick, but people still liked him in The Matrix and stuff like Constantine. But The Matrix is one of those movies that makes you question everything. It makes you wonder, is this real? Is reality actually as it seems? And that's one thing I absolutely love about it. Matrix is a fantastic movie, and I love just the idea of reality being a simulation, and we would have no way of knowing. That's the beauty of it. If that is actually the case, there's no fucking way in hell we would know that that's what's happening. So, yeah, Matrix is still on my list. It's still my number 10. I absolutely love that movie. Number 9, Donnie Darko. It was originally a lot higher on the list, but again, I've reevaluated and removed a lot of things. I've reevaluated and moved a few things, and also removed a couple of things. But Donnie Darko is still a movie that I like very, very much. Donnie Darko is a movie that I feel like you have to see twice to fully appreciate. because the first time through you might not fully understand the ending, but the second time you're definitely going to get it a little bit better. Donnie Darko is a very unconventional time travel movie and is a good example of a paradox, and that's part of why I like it so much. The characters are also fairly well written, especially Donnie himself, and it has Seth Rogen in a very early role. I believe it's his first role, actually. He played like this teenage bully character. Donnie Darko does a lot with fate and people being meant to die or fated to die or events fated to happen. It's all about this prophecy of the end of the world, and again, it's got some weird time travel stuff and paradox, and it's a very fun movie. Lots of suspense, lots of confusion, lots of drama. Great movie. Jake Gyllenhaal does a great job playing Donnie himself as well. Alright, number 8, we have Logan. Now, Logan was originally much, much higher on the list as well, but again, reevaluating things, it got pushed back a little bit. I still think it's a fantastic movie. It's easily my favorite superhero movie, and my favorite comic book movie. I would say Joker's also pretty up there, but again, that didn't quite make the list. But Logan is not your conventional superhero movie. It's very dark, very gritty, very violent. It's got a nice hard R rating. Lots of violence, swearing, alcohol, death, and it's just overall a very graphic movie. But that's not all. It's also very sad, very depressing, and it's in a world where the X-Men have all but gone extinct because they're almost all dead at the point this movie starts. In this movie, Professor Xavier is going senile, which is incredibly dangerous given the fact that all of his powers are mind-based. Logan himself is slowly deteriorating away because the adamantium inside of him is going bad. It's overall a very downer movie, and that's why I love it so much. It's also got a lot of elements of a Western, so that's a nice touch to it, too. I think that overall it's a very nice and gritty movie, the best of the X-Men movies by far, and the best superhero movie in my opinion. Alright, number 7, we have the first new addition to this list, and that is Cannibal Holocaust, which is a movie I had not seen when I did the previous list, and currently I think it's probably the most fucked up movie I've ever seen. I know that there's a hell of a lot worse out there, but Cannibal Holocaust is pretty fucked up. But Cannibal Holocaust was an early predecessor sort of to the found footage genre. There was a couple of movies that did use examples of found footage type techniques prior to Cannibal Holocaust, but Cannibal Holocaust was a very important stepping stone nonetheless. The first half of the movie of Cannibal Holocaust is not a found footage movie, but the second half is. With Cannibal Holocaust, it's this movie about a film crew that went down into this place in the Amazon called the Green Inferno, which gets referenced in several other movies, including, but not limited to, The Green Inferno, which is very much heavily inspired by Cannibal Holocaust and the cannibal boom that Cannibal Holocaust caused in the 70s. Because when Cannibal Holocaust came out, there were a lot of movies that tried to capitalize on its success. Sort of how there was a slasher boom in the US, there was a cannibal boom in Italy in the 70s. I did a whole review of Cannibal Holocaust as an episode of Cult Films a while back with Corbin, and as I said, it is one of the most fucked up movies I've ever seen. It has real animal death in it. It has fairly realistic human death, obviously not real human death, but fairly realistic looking. It has full frontal nudity, it has genital mutilation. It's very fucked up. But again, it's following this documentary crew that's doing all of this terrible stuff to these cannibals, and we're seeing it from the perspective of this doctor who goes down to investigate, and he's looking at it through their film reels and seeing all this terrible stuff they're doing to try and sensationalize their footage. The movie itself was kind of a social commentary on sensationalism in media and stuff like that, which I think is one of the reasons it's so high on my list, because I really like the kind of look into that and the social commentary with it. You don't really think you'd expect that with a movie called Cannibal Holocaust, and the other movies in the cannibal boom didn't really have that as much. But again, it is a fantastic movie, and I highly recommend it. It is definitely not for those of the faint of heart, and definitely not for children, though. It's very fucked up. Alright, number 6, we have Lord of the Rings. This was on my list last time. I'm pretty sure it was in a different spot, but again, things have been rearranged. You get the drill at this point. But Lord of the Rings, I'm counting the whole trilogy together because I love them all fairly similarly. I think my favorite is either Return of the King or Two Towers. I go back and forth between the two because they're both really great. Fellowship is also great, but I do think that the second and third movies in the trilogy do beat out Fellowship. But overall, it's taken as a trilogy, so I view it kind of as one picture. Lord of the Rings is very long, so some people might not be able to sit through it if they don't have the best attention span. It's almost 12 hours for watching all of them back to back, so it is a fairly long trilogy. And that's specifically including the extended version, which is the only version I really watch. I have seen the theatrical years ago, but I almost exclusively watch the extended version currently. But Lord of the Rings is easily my favorite fantasy series. Nothing else has really even come close. I mean, Game of Thrones is pretty good too, but it gets bad during the last 2 seasons. And Elder Scrolls is great. I say Elder Scrolls is another one of my favorite fantasy franchises, but again, it's not a movie, so there you go. I'm not the biggest fan of fantasy, but when done well, as in Lord of the Rings, there's a reason it's on this list. My favorite character in Lord of the Rings is Smeagol or Gollum. I know that's very unconventional, but I really enjoy every moment that he's on screen. I also quite like the Hobbit movies. I think they're underrated. They're definitely not as good as Lord of the Rings, but they're still really good. I've also seen the Lord of the Rings cartoon movies, and those are pretty good too, but again, the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings trilogy is easily the best Lord of the Rings adaptation, and my favorite version of the story. Number 5, A Clockwork Orange. Obviously, this was also in the previous one. This is another movie that gets hyped up as being one of the most fucked up movies ever, but I would say it pales in comparison to some of the shit you see in Cannibal Holocaust, so I think people exaggerate. It definitely is pretty fucked up. It has a lot of rape and violence in it, and it has a few torture scenes and things like that. It's definitely can be pretty graphic. But it's one of my favorite, like, sort of surrealist, dystopian-type movies. And it does something that I think that a lot of movies don't pull off as well, is it takes a complete and total piece of shit protagonist that's doing all this horrible stuff in the beginning and makes you sympathize with him by the end of the movie. And I think they do a spectacular job at doing that. Alex DeLarge is easily my favorite flawed protagonist. You really do start to sympathize with him by the end of the movie, and again, that's a tough thing to pull off, given that the first part of the movie is him beating homeless people up, raping people, and then killing a woman. So, they definitely accomplished something pretty substantial in making you sympathize with this guy by the end. Not to mention, A Clockwork Orange has its own complete set of slang words because they didn't want it to be dated when the guy wrote the book originally. It's a very unique movie experience, and I'd highly recommend checking it out. Alright, number 4, Psycho, was also on the previous one. Specifically, the first Psycho is my favorite, however, I do really like Psycho 2, 3, and 4 as well. Ranking the Psycho movies, I would say Psycho 1 is the best, obviously. Then Psycho 4, 2, then 3 in that order. 3 is definitely the lowest point of the series, but it's the only one that Anthony Perkins, the one who also plays Norman Bates, directed himself. And it's the story of a guy named Norman Bates who, spoiler for the first movie to an extent, but I think everyone already kind of knows the twist at the end of Psycho 1, but if you don't, you have been warned. Norman Bates has a split personality where he believes he is his mother carrying out these murders, and so he thinks his mother's doing it when it's actually him, because he killed his mother when he was younger. Now, the actual age he killed his mother at is inconsistent between both the movies themselves, the books, and the show Bates Motel. So there are many different versions of when exactly Norma Bates, his mother, was killed. And in fact, in the 1980s Bates Motel movie, which I'm not too keen on, his mother's name was actually Gloria Bates rather than Norma Bates, because her name actually is never revealed in the first movie. It is revealed in the sequels, but the Bates Motel 1987 movie is really not that great, and they had a different name for her there. But that's a weird movie where, like, the motel's, like, haunted and stuff, and it was actually supposed to be a pilot for a TV series. It's a whole weird thing. But Psycho 1, 2, 3, and 4 are great. I am also a fan of the Bates Motel series, with the first 3 seasons. Season 4 is boring, and Season 5 is garbage. Psycho was also a very important stepping stone for the slasher genre, and I've often called it the first slasher. It's not a traditional slasher, because it has a fairly low body count and doesn't have all of the slasher tropes yet. Not to mention the fact that there were movies that predated it, such as some Italian giallo movies, and of course Peeping Tom from the UK. But either way, Psycho was influential in helping to create what the slasher genre would become. Alright, number 3, Fight Club. Now, this was originally my number 1 favorite movie of all time, but throughout the years it has got pushed back a little. And that's partially due to the fact that I really, really like my number 1 choice, which, if you've been keeping up with my channel, you may be able to predict, but we'll get there in due time. And partially just because, you know, in all honesty, Fight Club, I liked it a little bit less. I still put it in my top 3, but I think that a lot of the messaging in it doesn't hit me as hard as it used to when I was a teenager. I still really like the movie, and I still think it's a great social commentary on consumerism and things like that, which is ironic because of all the Starbucks stuff in it. But I still think it's easily my third favorite movie of all time. I absolutely love Fight Club. It's great. It has a great twist at the ending. And the book it's based on is really good, too. The comic that was written after it's actually pretty bad. It had promised to start Fight Club 2, which is the graphic novel written by the original author. It started out pretty solid, but then it kind of became shit in the later issues of the comic. I honestly don't recommend reading Fight Club 2. Read Fight Club 1, sure. Watch the movie especially, though, because in my opinion, it's one of those rare instances where the movie is way better than the book. Same thing with Psycho, actually. The movie of Psycho is way better than the book. But Fight Club is a great movie. It's about these guys that start a secret fight club that ultimately ends up becoming much more than that, where they start sort of an uprising, and it becomes this very anti-consumerism, anti-corporate social commentary, and it's a great movie for it. I absolutely love Fight Club. All right, number 2, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Now this one's in the exact same spot it was last time, and I still stand by it. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is my favorite Western movie of all time. It's about these 3 bandits that are trying to find this $200,000 cache of gold. It's part of Sergio Leone's Man with No Name trilogy, which includes A Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, and then finally The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. They weren't originally intended to be a trilogy, but they've sort of been retroactively considered a trilogy. And I'm going to be honest, I haven't yet watched For a Few Dollars More, but I wasn't as big of a fan as A Fistful of Dollars, and from what I understand, it's actually kind of a rip-off of Seven Samurai anyway. But The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is a fucking masterpiece. It's almost 3 hours long, but you'd never feel like it drags. Each of the characters is very unique and likable in their own way. A lot of the Western tropes are played up in all the right ways, and the soundtrack is phenomenal. I love the plot to the movie, I love the setting, I love the characters, I love the soundtrack. Everything about this movie kicks ass. There's a lot of great dialogue in it. I remember there's a quote from Tuco I used to quote all the time, which is, "If you work for a living, why kill yourself working?" I also really like the scene where this guy gives him a little monologue when he's about to shoot him, and then Tuco just shoots him before he can finish, and he's like, "If you want to shoot, shoot, don't talk." Tuco is my favorite of the 3 characters, by the way. Tuco is played by Eli Wallach, whereas Blondie, or the Man with No Name, is played by Clint Eastwood, and Lee Van Cleef plays Angel Eyes, which is the bad. So, there's the good, which is Clint Eastwood's Blondie, there's the bad, which is Angel Eyes, and then there's the ugly, which is Tuco. And by ugly, they mean basically he didn't turn out as well as he could have. They don't mean literally ugly. The main theme song for this movie gets referenced all the time, but in my opinion, it is not the best song on the soundtrack. It's probably the second best song on the soundtrack, but the best one is the Ecstasy of Gold, which plays when they're actually at the cache of gold. This movie also has an iconic standoff at the end, so everything that you like about Westerns is in this movie. And I was never a big fan of Westerns when I was younger. There's a few standout examples I liked, but The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is easily the best Western of all time, and actually made me get more into the Western genre when I was younger. Admittedly, I haven't seen as many Westerns as some people may have, but The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, in my opinion, is the best Western, having seen what I have. Alright, number 1, and the only Takeshi movie I allowed myself to put on this list, which is Hanabi, also known as Fireworks. Now, Fireworks, or Hanabi, which I will just call Fireworks for simplicity's sake, because that's what my first release of it said on the case. It's typically referred to as Hanabi just in general now, but I'm just going to call it Fireworks for simplicity. Fireworks is a beautiful movie. It's a movie about a cop who quits the force because his partner got shot and because his wife has leukemia. And the movie essentially is just about him trying to spend what remaining time he has left with his wife. You also see what happens to his partner that got shot because his partner got crippled, and his wife left him and took the kids, so now he's stuck there just painting to try and kill time and feel less useless. Whereas the main character, Nishi, played by Takeshi, is trying to, like I said, just spend time with his wife, but he also has to pay back the Yakuza, who he took money from to pay for his wife's medical bills. So in order to pay them back, he robs a bank and then gives them the money. But then they come after him and say, "You need to pay us more interest." And it just spirals out of control from there. I won't spoil the ending of the movie, but it is such a sad and beautiful movie with a nice combination of drama, romance, tragedy, and violence all rolled into one. and it is easily my favorite movie of all time. It's also my favorite Takeshi movie of all time, obviously. Other Takeshi movies that I also could have put on this list would have been stuff like Sonatine and Dolls, but Hanabi beats them out really easily. I love this movie. This was the movie that put Takeshi on the map as being a serious director in Japan, because prior to this, they primarily looked at him as a stand-up comedian, which is how he got his start. But Hanabi is a sad and beautiful movie, and it deserves every award that it won. I've watched this movie the most times out of all of Takeshi's movies as well. I think this is the only one I've watched more than 3 times so far. That's not to say I won't watch his other movies more than that, don't get me wrong. You gotta remember, I only got into Takeshi like a year or 2 ago. And I've seen Hanabi 4 times already. That's how much I like it. It also is another one of Takeshi's movies that has a brilliant soundtrack by Joe Hisaishi, and all of Takeshi's best soundtracks typically were done by Joe Hisaishi. But yeah, I did a whole episode of Takeshi Tuesdays based on Hanabi, and I've talked about it many times otherwise. But anyway, that really does it for this top 10. I hope you've enjoyed it. There was only a couple of things that I added on that weren't on the previous version. But hopefully my rearranging and expanding on the things I talked about still made this worthwhile in watching. But anyway, this has been Fugitive Red Eye, and you have yourself a great little day, and toodles.
Suck it, you shit!
Fuck it. We've come this far.